Long before the name Samson became a legend whispered across the hills of Israel, before enemies trembled at the sound of his approach, and stories of his strength spread through villages and kingdoms, there was only a quiet struggle inside a small household that carried a deep sorrow. In a land where family meant survival and legacy, there lived a man named Manoah and his wife. They belonged to the tribe of Dan, a people who lived under constant pressure from a powerful enemy. The Israelites during that time were not the mighty kingdom they would one day become. Instead, they were a people oppressed, surrounded by threats, and often living under the control of a rival nation known as the Philistines. The Philistines were strong, organized, and ruthless in maintaining their dominance. Their cities stood fortified along the coastal plains, and their warriors were known for their skill in battle. For years they had tightened their grip over Israel, forcing the people to live under their rule. The Israelites had known freedom before, but during this dark period they were struggling to survive, hoping that one day someone would rise to challenge their oppressors. It was in the middle of this difficult era that Manoah's wife carried a heavy personal burden. She had no children. In the ancient world, this was not simply a private sadness, but something that affected a woman's place in society. Children meant future, continuity, and blessing. Without them, many families felt incomplete, and many women lived with quiet heartbreak. But one day something extraordinary happened. As Manoah's wife went about her daily routine, a figure suddenly appeared before her. He was not an ordinary traveler passing through the land. The presence of this figure carried a strange authority, something that immediately filled the moment with awe and fear. The visitor spoke words that would change the course of history. He told her that although she had been unable to have children, she would soon give birth to a son. The promise itself was miraculous enough, but the message did not end there. The child she would bear would not be an ordinary child. He would be dedicated to God from the moment of his birth, set apart for a special purpose. Because of this calling, the messenger gave very specific instructions. The boy was to live under a sacred vow. His hair was never to be cut. He was not to drink wine or strong drink. His life would follow a path of discipline and dedication that symbolized his commitment to God. This vow was known as the Nazirite vow, a sacred promise that separated a person from ordinary life and devoted them entirely to the service of God. And the child she would give birth to would carry that vow from the moment he entered the world. Then the messenger revealed the purpose of the boy's life. He would begin to deliver Israel from the oppression of the Philistines. The woman rushed to tell her husband what had happened. Manoah listened carefully as she described the mysterious visitor and the promise he had spoken. But the news was so astonishing that Manoah prayed, asking God to send the messenger again so that they could better understand what they were supposed to do. God answered that prayer. The messenger appeared once more, and this time Manoah himself spoke with him. He asked how the child should be raised and what rules they must follow. The instructions remained the same. The boy must be raised with the Nazirite vow, living a life set apart for God's purpose. Realizing that they were standing in the presence of someone extraordinary, Manoah offered to prepare food for the visitor, but the messenger told him instead to offer a sacrifice to God. As the flames of the sacrifice rose from the altar, something remarkable happened. The messenger stepped into the flame and ascended upward in the fire, disappearing into the heavens. In that moment, Manoah and his wife understood that they had not simply spoken with a traveler or prophet. They had encountered an angel of the Lord. Overwhelmed with fear and wonder, they fell to the ground. Manoah believed they might die for having seen such a divine messenger. But his wife reminded him that if God had intended to destroy them, he would not have given them such a promise. Soon afterward, the promise began to unfold. The woman gave birth to a son. They named him Samson. From the beginning, there was something different about this child. As he grew, the presence of God seemed to rest upon his life in a powerful way. The scriptures describe that the Spirit of the Lord began to stir within him as he grew into a young man. Samson was not raised like other boys in Israel. His life carried the weight of a divine purpose. His uncut hair symbolized his Nazirite vow, marking him as someone dedicated to God. His parents understood that their son had been chosen for something extraordinary, something that would eventually affect the entire nation. And yet, like many people who carry great potential, Samson also possessed a personality that would lead him into dangerous territory. As he grew older, his strength became impossible to ignore. It was not simply the strength of a trained warrior or a strong young man accustomed to labor. Samson's power seemed almost supernatural, as though something beyond human ability flowed through him. But along with that strength came a restless spirit. Samson lived during a time when the Israelites were meant to avoid deep connections with the people who ruled over them. The Philistines were not simply political enemies. Their culture and beliefs stood in direct opposition to the faith of Israel. Yet Samson's heart did not always follow the boundaries that had been set before him. One day, Samson traveled to a Philistine town called Timnah. It was there that he saw a woman who immediately captured his attention. She was a Philistine, a member of the very nation that oppressed his people. But Samson did not see an enemy. He saw someone he desired. When he returned home, he told his parents something that shocked them. He said he wanted to marry her. Manoah and his wife were troubled by this request. They reminded Samson that there were many women among the people of Israel who shared their faith and traditions. Why would he choose someone from among the Philistines, the very people who ruled over them? But Samson was stubborn. He insisted that this was the woman he wanted. His parents eventually agreed to arrange the marriage. Though they could not fully understand why Samson felt so strongly about it, what they did not realize was that something larger was beginning to unfold. Something that would set Samson on a path toward confrontation with the Philistines. As Samson traveled again toward Timnah with his parents to arrange the marriage, an unexpected moment occurred that revealed the true extent of his strength. While walking through the vineyards near the town, a young lion suddenly rushed toward him, roaring as it attacked. Most men in that moment would have run or searched desperately for a weapon. But Samson had neither sword nor spear in his hands. Instead, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. With nothing but his bare hands, Samson seized the lion and tore it apart as easily as someone might tear apart a small animal. It was an act of strength so shocking that he did not even tell his parents what had happened. The young man who had been born with a divine calling was beginning to reveal the power placed within him. But the same strength that made him unstoppable in battle would soon be tested by something far more dangerous. Because the greatest battles in Samson's life would not be fought with lions or armies. They would be fought within his own heart. And the choices he made in the coming years would transform him from a hero of Israel into one of the most tragic figures in the history of the Bible. The journey toward Timnah continued as Samson and his parents prepared for what should have been a joyful occasion. Marriage in the ancient world was not simply the union of two people. It was the joining of families and the strengthening of social bonds. Yet Samson's marriage was already unusual. The woman he had chosen was not from among the people of Israel, but from the land of their oppressors, the Philistines. To Samson, this difference seemed unimportant. His decision had been driven by desire, not by careful thought about what it might mean for his future or for the calling placed upon his life. But beneath the surface of this strange union, events were beginning to move in a direction that neither Samson nor his parents fully understood. When Samson returned to Timnah for the wedding celebration, he passed again through the same vineyards where he had previously encountered the young lion. Curiosity led him to look for the carcass of the animal he had killed. What he discovered there was unexpected. Inside the remains of the lion, a swarm of bees had built a hive, and within it there was honey. Samson reached into the carcass and scooped out the honey, eating it as he walked along the road. He even shared some with his parents, though he did not tell them where it had come from. For someone under a Nazirite vow, touching a dead body was forbidden, yet Samson seemed increasingly willing to ignore the boundaries that had once marked his life as sacred. Soon the wedding celebration began. In the culture of that time, wedding feasts often lasted several days and involved large gatherings of friends and relatives. Feasting, music, laughter, and conversation filled the air. Samson, as the groom, found himself surrounded by companions, chosen by the Philistines to attend the celebration with him. But Samson was not simply a man of strength. He also enjoyed testing his cleverness. During the feast, he presented a riddle to the 30 Philistine men assigned to accompany him. He said that if they could solve the riddle within 7 days of the feast, he would give them 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. But if they failed to solve it, they would have to give him the same. Confident in their intelligence, the men agreed. Then Samson spoke the riddle, drawing from the strange moment he had experienced with the lion and the honey. He said, "Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet." The Philistine companions were immediately puzzled. They whispered among themselves, trying to understand what the riddle could possibly mean. Days passed as they searched for the answer, but none of them could solve it. The truth was impossible for them to guess. Only Samson knew about the lion he had killed and the honey he had found within it. As the days of the feast continued, the Philistine men grew increasingly desperate. Losing the wager would cost them valuable garments, and their pride would suffer as well. So they turned to a darker solution. They approached Samson's new wife and threatened her. They demanded that she persuade Samson to reveal the answer to the riddle. If she refused, they warned that they would burn her and her family alive. Fear filled her heart. She returned to Samson weeping, accusing him of not truly loving her. She pleaded with him day after day, begging him to share the answer to the riddle so she could prove that he trusted her. At first Samson refused. He pointed out that he had not even told the answer to his own parents. But her constant tears and pressure slowly wore him down. Finally, before the 7th day of the feast ended, Samson told her the secret. And as soon as she learned it, she ran to the Philistine men and revealed the answer. On the final day, before sunset, the men approached Samson confidently and spoke the solution to the riddle. What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion? In that moment, Samson understood exactly what had happened. His anger burned instantly. He realized that his wife had betrayed him under the pressure of the Philistine men. Furious and humiliated, Samson answered them with words filled with bitterness. He told them that if they had not plowed with his heifer, they would never have solved the riddle. But the wager still had to be paid. Samson had promised 30 garments to the men if they solved the riddle. And so something powerful and dangerous awakened within him. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Samson again. Driven by fury, he traveled to the Philistine city of Ashkelon. There he confronted 30 Philistine men and killed them, taking their garments and bringing them back to pay his debt to those who had solved the riddle. It was a violent and shocking act, one that marked the beginning of a long and bitter conflict between Samson and the Philistines. After delivering the garments, Samson returned to his father's house in anger, leaving his new wife behind. But the story did not end there. While Samson was away, the woman he had married was given to another man, the very companion who had served as Samson's best man during the wedding feast. When Samson later returned intending to visit his wife, he discovered what had happened. The betrayal cut deep. Once again, anger exploded within him. This time Samson decided to take revenge not against individuals, but against the entire Philistine nation. His method was strange and destructive. He captured 300 foxes and tied them together in pairs by their tails. Between each pair, he placed a burning torch. Then he released them into the Philistine fields. The foxes ran wildly through the farmland, setting fire to the grain fields, vineyards, and olive groves of the Philistines. The destruction spread quickly across the countryside, burning the harvest and causing massive loss. When the Philistines discovered what had happened, they demanded to know who was responsible. The answer came quickly: Samson. And when they learned that the destruction had been caused by Samson because his wife had been given to another man, their response was brutal. They went to the woman and her father and burned them to death. Violence had now spiraled out of control. Samson, hearing what had happened, declared that he would not stop until he had taken revenge. He attacked the Philistines fiercely, striking them down with great slaughter. Eventually he withdrew and lived in a cave in the territory of Judah. But the conflict he had started would not disappear so easily. The Philistines gathered an army and marched into Judah, determined to capture Samson. The people of Judah, terrified of provoking their powerful oppressors, confronted Samson and asked why he had brought this trouble upon them. 3,000 men from Judah came to the cave where Samson was hiding. They told him that the Philistines ruled over them, and that his actions had placed the entire nation in danger. Samson listened, and then agreed to allow them to bind him with ropes, so they could hand him over to the Philistines on one condition: they must promise not to kill him themselves. The men agreed, and so they tied Samson with new ropes and delivered him to the waiting Philistine army. From the outside, it appeared that the great warrior had finally been captured. The enemy believed their problem had been solved, but they did not yet understand who they were dealing with, because the moment Samson stepped into the hands of the Philistines, something extraordinary was about to happen again, and the power that had once allowed him to tear apart a lion would soon reveal itself in a way that would leave hundreds of Philistine warriors lying dead. The legend of Samson was only beginning. Bound with ropes and surrounded by enemies, Samson was led toward the waiting army of the Philistines. The men of Judah had kept their promise not to harm him, but they had delivered him directly into the hands of those who wanted him dead. From a distance, the Philistine warriors saw their prisoner approaching, tied and seemingly powerless, and a roar of triumph rose from their ranks. For years Samson had been a growing threat to them, a man whose strength had humiliated their people and destroyed their crops. Now it appeared that the problem had finally been solved. The Philistines rushed forward shouting in victory as Samson was brought into their presence. But what they did not realize was that the ropes around his arms meant nothing when the power within him awakened. As the crowd closed in, something familiar surged through Samson's body once again. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him with overwhelming force. The ropes that bound his arms suddenly snapped apart, as though they had been burned by fire. What had looked like captivity turned into something entirely different in a matter of seconds. Samson looked around for a weapon, but found none. On the ground nearby lay the fresh jawbone of a donkey, discarded and forgotten. In the hands of an ordinary man, it would have been useless. In the hands of Samson, it became a weapon of devastating power. He picked it up and charged into the Philistine warriors. The scene must have been terrifying for those who witnessed it. A single man, armed with nothing more than a bone, fighting against an army. Yet Samson moved with unstoppable force, striking down enemy after enemy. His strength seemed endless, each blow sending another warrior crashing to the ground. The Philistines had expected a helpless prisoner. Instead, they faced a storm of power they could not control. By the time the battle ended, 1,000 Philistine soldiers lay dead. Samson stood alone among them, still holding the jawbone that had become the instrument of their defeat. Breathing heavily, he looked over the battlefield and spoke words that mixed triumph with bitter humor. With a donkey's jawbone I have made donkeys of them. With a donkey's jawbone I have killed 1,000 men. After the fight, exhaustion finally overtook him. The intense battle had drained his strength, and the desert heat pressed down on him as thirst threatened to overcome him. In that moment, Samson cried out to God, recognizing that even his incredible power depended on something beyond himself. He prayed that God would not allow him to die of thirst after such a great victory. And God answered. Water suddenly flowed from a hollow place in the ground, giving Samson the strength he needed to recover. The place where this happened became known as a reminder that even the strongest man must rely on God for life itself. From From that point forward, Samson began to take on a new role among the people of Israel. He became a judge, one of the leaders raised up during the difficult period before Israel had kings. Judges were not kings or rulers in the traditional sense. They were deliverers, men and women raised up in times of crisis to defend Israel and guide the people. For 20 years, Samson served as a judge in Israel. During those years, his reputation grew larger than life. Stories of his strength spread across the land, and the Philistines remained wary of confronting him directly. Yet despite the victories he achieved, Samson's life continued to move in unpredictable directions. He was a man chosen by God and gifted with extraordinary power, but he also carried weaknesses that constantly placed him in danger. One of the most striking examples of this came during a journey to the Philistine city of Gaza. Gaza was one of the strongest cities under Philistine control, surrounded by walls designed to keep enemies out and protect the people inside. It was not a place where Samson should have felt safe, yet he entered the city anyway. When the Philistines discovered that Samson was inside Gaza, they saw an opportunity they had been waiting for. Quietly they surrounded the city gates and set guards throughout the night. Planning to kill him in the morning, they believed they had finally trapped the man who had humiliated them so many times before. But Samson did not wait until morning. In the middle of the night he rose from where he had been staying and walked toward the city gates. Those gates were enormous structures designed to secure the city from attack. Thick wooden doors were set into heavy posts, reinforced with bars and iron. Normally it would take many men to open or close them. Samson approached the gates alone. With his immense strength he lifted the entire gate structure doors, posts, and bar from the ground itself. Then, carrying them on his shoulders, he walked out of the city and up a nearby hill, leaving the gates behind as a symbol of his power. When the Philistines discovered what had happened, the message was clear. The man they feared was still beyond their control. Yet despite all his victories and all the fear he inspired among his enemies, Samson continued making choices that would eventually lead him into the greatest danger of his life. Time and time again, his weakness appeared in the same place, his heart. Samson had a pattern of becoming involved with women from among the Philistines, the very people he was meant to oppose. His desires often pulled him into situations where his judgment was clouded, and those around him began to notice. The Philistines themselves began searching for a way to defeat him. Realizing that strength alone could not be matched through battle, if they wanted to destroy Samson, they would have to find another way, and soon they would discover exactly how to do it. Because in the valley of Sorek there lived a woman whose name would become forever tied to the downfall of the strongest man in the Bible. Her name was Delilah, and the moment Samson met her, the final chapter of his story quietly began. Somewhere in the quiet valleys between the hills of Israel and the lands controlled by the Philistines, there was a place known as the Valley of Sorek. It was there that the final chapter of Samson's story began to unfold, not on a battlefield, not in the chaos of war, but in something far more subtle and far more dangerous. There lived a woman named Delilah. The scriptures do not tell us much about her background. We do not know where she came from or what her life had been before Samson entered it. What we do know is that Samson fell deeply in love with her. This moment would change everything. For years, the Philistines had tried to defeat Samson through strength. They had sent soldiers against him. They had surrounded cities and planned ambushes. Yet none of it had worked. Again and again Samson had escaped their traps, humiliating their warriors and proving that no army could overpower him. But the rulers of the Philistines were patient. They had begun to understand something about their enemy. Samson's greatest weakness was not his strength. It was his heart. When the Philistine leaders discovered Samson's relationship with Delilah, they saw an opportunity they had been waiting for. Quietly, they approached her with a proposal. They promised her an enormous reward of silver if she could discover the secret behind Samson's incredible strength. Their plan was simple. If they could learn what made him powerful, they could finally destroy him. Delilah agreed. At first, her approach was gentle. She spoke to Samson with affection and curiosity, asking him a simple question. She said, "Tell me the secret of your great strength and how you could be tied up and subdued." Samson answered her, but he did not reveal the truth. Instead, he told her that if he were tied with 7 fresh bowstrings that had never been dried, he would become as weak as any other man. Delilah passed the information to the Philistine rulers, who brought the bowstrings to her secretly while Samson slept. She tied him with them and then shouted that the Philistines were coming. But the moment Samson woke, he snapped the bowstrings apart as easily as a thread burned by fire. The trap had failed. Delilah pretended to be hurt by his deception. She told him he had made her look foolish and begged him again to reveal the secret of his strength. Samson answered with another lie. He said that if he were tied with brand new ropes that had never been used, he would lose his power. Once again, Delilah passed the information to the Philistines. Once again, she waited until Samson slept. And once again, the moment he awoke, the ropes broke apart in his hands. Still, the truth remained hidden. But Delilah was persistent. Day after day, she questioned him. Day after day, she complained that he did not truly love her if he continued hiding the truth. Samson tried to avoid the subject, offering another false explanation. He told her that if the 7 braids of his hair were woven tightly into a loom, he would lose his strength. But even that trick failed when Samson awoke and tore himself free once again. By now the Philistine leaders must have been growing impatient. But Delilah continued pressing Samson relentlessly. The scriptures say she troubled him day after day until he was sick to death of her nagging. And finally, Samson did something that would change his life forever. He told her the truth. He revealed that his strength came from the vow placed upon him before his birth. He explained that his hair had never been cut because he had been dedicated to God as a Nazirite from the moment he entered the world. If my head were shaved, he told her, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man. This time Delilah knew he had finally revealed the truth. She sent word to the Philistine rulers to come once more, bringing the silver they had promised. When Samson fell asleep with his head in her lap, she called for a man to shave off the 7 locks of his hair. Slowly, carefully, the hair that had symbolized his sacred vow was cut away. And in that moment, everything changed. When Delilah cried out that the Philistines were upon him, Samson woke expecting to break free just as he had before. But something was different. The strength that had once surged through his body was gone. The scriptures describe the moment with quiet tragedy. Samson did not realize that the Lord had left him. The Philistines rushed in and captured him. This time there was no miracle of strength, no sudden breaking of ropes, no escape. They seized him, bound him, and did something cruel that revealed their desire for revenge. They gouged out his eyes. The man who had once terrified armies was now blind. They took him to the city of Gaza, the same city whose gates he had once carried away on his shoulders. But this time he did not enter as a conqueror. He entered as a prisoner. The Philistines forced Samson into hard labor, making him grind grain in the prison like an animal. The once mighty judge of Israel had fallen to the lowest point of his life. Day after day he walked in darkness, pushing the grinding stone, surrounded by enemies who laughed at the memory of the warrior he had once been. Yet something small and quiet began happening during those long days in prison. His hair started to grow again. Time passed. Eventually, the Philistine rulers decided to celebrate what they believed was their greatest victory. They gathered thousands of people inside a massive temple dedicated to their god Dagon. The building was filled with lords, nobles, and spectators who came to witness the humiliation of the man who had once terrified them. They called for Samson to be brought out so they could mock him. Blind and weakened, Samson was led into the temple by a young servant boy. The crowd roared with laughter, praising their god for delivering their enemy into their hands. But Samson asked the boy guiding him to place his hands on the pillars that supported the temple. He wanted to rest against them. Then, for the first time in a long while, Samson prayed. He called out to God and asked for strength one final time. Not for glory, not for victory, only for one last chance to strike against the enemies who had blinded him. The prayer was simple, but it was heard. Samson placed his hands against the two central pillars, holding up the temple. With a deep breath, he pushed. At first nothing seemed to happen, but then the massive structure began to shift. Stone groaned against stone, the pillars trembled, and suddenly the entire temple collapsed. Thousands of Philistines were crushed as the building fell. Samson died beneath the rubble along with them. In that final moment, the man who had spent his life battling the Philistines defeated more enemies in his death than he had during his life. His family later recovered his body and buried him in the tomb of his father Manoah. And so ended the life of Samson. He had been a man chosen before birth, a warrior gifted with supernatural strength, a judge who led Israel for 20 years. Yet his life also became a powerful warning. Strength alone cannot protect a person from their weaknesses. Power without discipline can lead to destruction. And sometimes the greatest battles a person faces are not against enemies on the outside, but against the desires within their own heart. The story of Samson remains one of the most dramatic and tragic stories in the Bible, not simply because he was the strongest man who ever lived, but because he was also a man who discovered too late that the greatest strength in life is not found in muscles or weapons. It is found in the ability to guard the heart. When the dust settled over the ruins of the temple that day, silence replaced the roar of the crowd that had once filled the great hall of the Philistines. What had begun as a celebration of victory had turned into one of the most shocking disasters the Philistine rulers had ever experienced. The pillars that once held up their proud temple now lay broken beneath piles of stone and timber. Beneath that rubble lay thousands of people who had come to mock the fallen hero of Israel. Among them was the man they had believed they had defeated forever, Samson. The strongest man who had ever lived had died in that final moment of destruction. But his story did not end with the collapse of the temple. In many ways, that moment became the final symbol of the complicated life he had lived. For years Samson had stood as a force of chaos in the eyes of the Philistines. His sudden attacks, his impossible strength, and his unpredictable actions had humiliated their armies again and again. But for the people of Israel, Samson represented something different. He was a reminder that even during times of oppression, God had not abandoned them. Israel during that era was not a powerful kingdom. It had no mighty king sitting on a throne in Jerusalem. Instead, the nation was scattered among tribes, often divided and struggling to defend itself. Yet throughout those difficult years, leaders known as judges rose up at crucial moments to protect the people. Samson was one of the last of those judges. But unlike some of the others, Samson was not remembered for wise speeches or careful leadership. His life was filled with contradictions. He possessed enormous strength but struggled with self-control. He had been dedicated to God before his birth, yet he repeatedly placed himself in situations that threatened the vow he carried. And yet, despite those failures, his story still carried meaning. Because the life of Samson shows something deeply human. Great potential does not always lead to a perfect life. Even people chosen for extraordinary purposes can struggle with weakness. Samson's strength was unmatched, but the battles he lost were not against soldiers. They were against temptation, pride, and desire. His victories were dramatic, but his failures were quiet and personal, unfolding through choices that slowly pulled him away from the path set before him. The most tragic part of Samson's downfall came in the moment he revealed the secret of his strength to Delilah. That moment was not simply about hair being cut. It represented the breaking of the sacred vow that had defined his life since birth. The hair itself was only a symbol. What truly mattered was the devotion behind it. When Samson allowed that symbol to be destroyed, he also allowed the connection it represented to be broken. Yet even then, the story does not end entirely in defeat. In the darkness of the prison, where Samson was forced to grind grain like an animal, something small began happening that few people noticed. His hair began to grow again. At first, this detail may seem unimportant, but within the story it carries a deeper meaning. The growing hair symbolized the possibility of restoration. Though Samson had fallen, though he had lost his strength and his freedom, the connection between him and God had not completely vanished. When Samson prayed in the temple before pushing against the pillars, it was the first time in the story that we hear him speak directly to God. Since his earlier victories, that prayer was not filled with pride. It was filled with humility. He did not ask to regain his strength for glory or revenge alone. He asked for strength one final time so that he might strike against the enemies, who had mocked both him and the people of Israel. And God answered. The final act of Samson's life became both tragic and heroic at the same time. The warrior who had spent years fighting the Philistines died alongside them, bringing destruction to their leaders, and reminding them that the power they feared had not disappeared completely. After the temple collapsed, Samson's family came to retrieve his body from the ruins. They carried him away from the shattered building and buried him in the tomb of his father Manoah. The place where he was laid to rest marked the end of one of the most extraordinary lives recorded. In the Bible, Samson had judged Israel for 20 years. During those 2 decades, he had become a legend whose story would be told for generations. Children would hear about the man who tore apart a lion with his bare hands. They would hear about the warrior who killed 1,000 soldiers with the jawbone of a donkey. They would hear about the night he carried away the gates of a city on his shoulders. But they would also hear about his weakness. They would hear about how his heart led him into danger. And they would hear about how even the strongest man in the world could fall when he allowed temptation to control his life. That is why the story of Samson has continued to fascinate readers for thousands of years. It is not just the story of a warrior. It is the story of human strength and human weakness existing side by side. It reminds us that power alone is never enough. Wisdom, discipline, and faithfulness must stand beside it. Samson's life also reminds us that failure does not always erase a person's purpose. Even after his greatest mistakes, Samson still played a role in weakening the Philistine power that oppressed Israel. His final act became part of the long struggle that would eventually lead to Israel's freedom. But perhaps the most important lesson of Samson's life is the one that echoes quietly through the entire story. A person's greatest strength is not physical power. It is the ability to guard their heart. Because the enemies that defeat us most often are not the ones who attack from outside. They are the ones that slowly grow within. And that is why the story of Samson still matters today. Not only because he was the strongest man who ever lived, but because his life reminds us that true strength is not measured by how much power we possess. It is measured by how faithfully we choose to use it. Here is a cinematic ending narration. You can place in the last 30 to 60 seconds of the video about Samson. As the dust settled over the ruins of the temple, the life of Samson came to its final silence. The man who had once shaken armies, the warrior who had terrified the Philistines with nothing but his bare hands, was gone. His strength had been legendary. His victories had been unforgettable. But his story was never only about power. Samson was a man chosen before he was even born. A man set apart for a purpose greater than himself. Yet his life reminds us of something that echoes through every generation. The greatest dangers we face are not always the enemies standing before us. Sometimes they are the desires growing quietly within us. Samson defeated lions. He defeated armies. He defeated thousands of warriors. But the battle that changed his life forever was the battle inside his own heart. And yet, even in his final moment, when everything seemed lost, Samson turned back to God. One final prayer, one final act of strength, one final moment that would echo through history. His story is not just the story of the strongest man who ever lived. It is the story of how power, without discipline, can destroy a life, and how even a broken man can still find redemption in his final moment. Because true strength is not only found in victory. True strength is found in the choices we make when everything is at stake. And that is why the story of Samson continues to be told, not only as a legend of strength, but as a warning about the human heart.